So I'd like to introduce our presenter for the day. Her name is Zoe Double. She's a research fellow from the University of Adelaide, all the way from Australia. So let's give her a warm welcome as she's flown here for many hours.
So you have to excuse my jet lag. I only got off the plane on Wednesday. So I'd just like to thank Megan for organising this. I think it just sounds like a fantastic initiative, this Speak series, and also Anna as well, who's helped organise this, enabled me to come and speak today. So today I'm just going to briefly just talk about 2 minutes about myself, just to tell you where I've come from. I'm an ecologist, mostly in marine systems, and this was just a picture of my first project when I was a baby honours student, which is similar to masters. I discovered how to age octopus, and this is a cross-section of an octopus shell. And octopus do have shells, and you might not know it. And that was a very satisfying project to work on, because now they use this method for octopus fisheries around the world. And then with my PhD, I learned how to become an octopus fisherwoman, catching octopus all around Tasmania. Tasmania is where I grew up and did my studies. So I caught octopus and looked at connectivity and dispersal of octopus, using as well as genetics and the chemistry of their bones and their shells. So that's when I moved to the University of Adelaide in the state of South Australia, where it's hot and arid, and I worked on all sorts of different biominerals and looking at the chemistry, and they're just some of the more recent papers, where if people aren't familiar with this type of work, we have these growth bands through time, which represents the age of the animal, such as a fish, the fish bone, and then we can reconstruct the life history, etc., of the fish. And this is another field site of mine in the Bay of Plenty of New Zealand, and this is more recent work. It's a magnificent island, it's volcanic, and it's underwater. It's a carbon dioxide vent. Where we work is called Champagne Bay, because it is like a soda stream underwater. It's bubbling out carbon dioxide. And underneath here, you can effectively look at effects of future climate change at these natural carbon dioxide vents, and what the marine world will look like in about 2100 and beyond. So you can sort of track the changes. So that's some of the work we've been doing at White Island. It's a very spectacular place. And this is more, but going back to cephalopods, this is my specialty, and I've come over here to the US to go to the University of Washington to speak about this work I worked on the global proliferation of cephalopods, and this is the talk I'm giving in Seattle next week. But another aspect of the work I've been doing is more and more about scientific writing and how we can effectively think about it differently to change, to boost the influence of what we write, to get it out of our traditional way of writing. This is taking up more of my research time, so it's sort of kind of split now between marine ecology and scientific writing. Now we're actually doing research on this as well. So today's not so much about, there's plenty of writing guides out there, how to write different parts of a paper. I'm focusing on peer-reviewed publications, even though there is lots of different aspects, and this will feed into many aspects of writing, but that is the focus. So today's not about sort of how writing different parts of papers, that's sort of well and truly covered. It's about challenging and thinking about writing and how we might, trying to shift our culture, because we're sort of stuck in the mud in how we write, to boost sort of our readership. So this is the first sentence of one of our papers, is that most scientists write as if their papers will be read by few and enjoyed by none. We wrote this with Scott Montgomery, who I'm also visiting at the University of Washington. He wrote the Chicago Guide to Communicating Science. So we wrote this paper with us. And he sort of tweaked this sentence, and I really liked how he wrote it, because a lot of people as scientists can relate to that. We publish these papers that are meant to be sort of locked away. We don't really think of a reader reading our papers. We're just sort of thinking of the data, the words, the means to the end to describe the figures. There's nothing really about reader empathy. And if you Google online how to read a scientific paper, there is such a plethora of guides out there about how to read scientific papers. And I think it was quite ironic that we put all this energy into wondering about how to read a scientific paper. And these guides brace you for the hard work ahead. They're not really that. They say, this is one of my favourites from science. And, these some things you might feel that when you read a scientific paper, even if you've been doing it for a long time, they're hard to get through. And there's just so many guides, and I think we're putting this energy about how to read a scientific paper. Why can't we put more energy into making them more readable in the first place? And this is summed up. We had some communication with Steve Pinker. Some of you might have heard of him. He's a bit of a rock star in the sort of psychology and linguistics world at Harvard University. We sort of sent him our paper and we got sort of feedback from him. And he's talked about this in the past as why should a profession, so he's talking about academia in general, that trades in words and dedicates itself to the transmission of knowledge, so often turns out prose that is turgid, soggy, wooden, bloated, clumsy and skew. It's quite strong language, unpleasant to read and impossible to understand. You kind of sort of hit the nail on the head. And what my colleague and I, Sean Connell, we sort of called it the official style, this way we write. And here's a perfect example of the way we write. And ironically, we got this one because it was published in the Journal of Science Communication about how to communicate better. But you can read that you might have to read that sentence 10 times to work out what was going on, even if there was no jargon. And some recent research by some Swedish neuroscientists have also quantified readability using a very simplistic metric, that our readability in our papers is decreasing over time. So because we work on like climate change projections, you know, we predict by 2100, like, you know, none of us will be able to understand each other. We'll be so siloed in our disciplines that, you know, our readability will be below zero. So that's what started off Sean and I writing a paper about how to write papers, because we're writing a lot together. We're sort of like to be a bit creative, and we're frustrated that even in our niche discipline, we couldn't understand what we were reading. And then we were writing and we're like, can't we write a bit better? And we're like, no, we're scientists. We're not allowed to write like that. And we're like, why not? Because it's inappropriate. Why is it inappropriate? It just is. Scientists have to write in a certain way. And then we started questioning it. I'm like, I want to write a paper about this. So I did. And we published it in Tree, and that was to get great journal to get into because it's influential in our field, to show that people were sort of listening to this question. So why we do it? So modern scientific writing sort of came about in the 17th century, where people like Francis Bacon and Isaac Newton thought that, you know, they spoke before that in Elizabethan terms, where it was all like flowery, flamboyant language, and they needed to, science became a thing to, like, you know, lead us into numberless idle fantasies. You know, fancies is what they thought, and they need simple, unadorned speech. But I think I think clarity and simplicity is really important, but we may have taken a step too far in making our writing very impersonal and hard for the reader to understand. So this is what I call the objectivity myth. I think as scientists, we write in the way that we do because we think that if we want to be objective and precise, we must be quite boring and dry and detailed. Because we're very wary of this. We don't want to be sensationalist. We don't want to oversell or story fit or oversimplify, because that's bad science. And we're not advocating that at all. We spent quite a section in our paper writing about the difference between what we think is sensationalism and what we think is just, you can be objective and creative at the same time. And this is what we think when sensationalism, when you might be a bit, it's an easier, quicker route to sell a publication. You want to boost that publication up, so you might simplify it, and that's easier to do to make more approachable, readable writing. So this, we got email feedback from a lot of editors-in-chief of journals, and we spoke to Paul Craze, who's editor-in-chief of Tree, again, one of our most influential journals, so it was good to get his feedback. And he sort of clarified this myth that scientific writing can and should be accurate, but avoid that dull tone that people confuse with intellectual rigour. And when we wrote a piece for The Conversation, this is one of the feedback we got from one of our people that read it, and I thought it was quite funny. And Helen Sword's a literary scholar in New Zealand, and we've been talking, she's an expert on making academic writing more readable in the humanities, but she's, it doesn't really come across to science that well, but she did this analysis to say, we're not shaped by convention. No one's telling us to write it the way we do. We're just doing it because everyone else is. We're following a trend. This is what I thought was quite a paradox with science, because scientific discovery in itself is creativity. That's what it is. It's based on novelty, creative thinking, a constant evolution, and then that we create knowledge. The scientific writing is based on a very orthodox teaching style. It's very formulaic, and it sort of suppresses creativity. If you try to write a bit differently, it's often, in some situations, it's stigmatised or suppressed. And I think that's ironic that this is we create knowledge, and this hampers the knowledge we create. And this is the key figure from our paper, which sort of sums up everything that I've spoken about. And this is when I thought if I was talking about creativity, I had to practice what I preach. And I sort of, this was a really serious science journal, and I thought the editor would laugh at me when I put this in there. I had a dream about it, and then I drew it out. You know, about insomnia. I thought, oh my God, I said, you know, sending this to an editor intrigued. So it's based off the tortoise and the hare, which is Aesop's fable. Most of you know the tortoise and the hare race, and the slower, steady tortoise wins. So I just recreated scientific titles, just based off an Aesop's fable. I just made them up. And this is what I view as our current writing culture and the words that define it. Now, I got these words from the undergraduate writing guides from the top Australian universities, University of Sydney, Melbourne, those sort of places. And these are the sort of accurate, strictly relevant, objective and personal. There's nothing wrong with that, but it's missing anything about reader engagement. So we're not training people to think about the reader. So while it's accurate, we sort of get this inaccessible writing style. But as again, we want to be certain that we're not advocating the black square, which is what I call the counterculture, which is like the media style of writing. So while it's accurate, while it's accessible, it's not very accurate. So we thought we could have this future culture where I see we can have original writing, but still have your objectivity too. So where do I start? So I'm just going to talk a few things you might think about in changing our writing from our kind of stiff, impersonal tone. And this might seem really obvious, but I think it's probably the most important thing. I know, being educated in Australia in science, writing wasn't really a valued skill in undergrad. It's not really emphasised, even though I spent most of my career writing. You know, quantitative skills are hugely emphasised, which is critically important, and they involve a change with time. But writing doesn't evolve with time. It's sort of this based on this formula that never changes. So I think we need to value writing skills more in science and understand that those skills will evolve like anything else. And this is another from an email with the editor-in-chief saying that sort of summed it up, that writing is key to any successful scientific career. And we gave a keynote recently in Education Futures Forum at the Australian Academy of Science in Canberra. And I just got this is a photograph of an education futurist from New Zealand, and she did this amazing talk about where we might be working. It's all focused on the human-only skills as robots take more and more of our, you know, in terms of monotonous chores away. And there's this boosting of storytelling and creative skills that people want, which I thought tied in nicely. So we're already influenced by the writing we read every day. And so a lot of the science writing is not a particularly good example of good writing. So unconsciously you're already influenced by and you're emulating styles of a lot of writing that you read, because, I mean, everyone does. And you've adapted their writing. So talk about why not make conscious decisions of what sort of writing you might emulate. So when you see a really good piece of writing, collect it, study it and emulate it, copy it. So sometimes you find a good paper that's written well and you go, you don't know why it is, but it just is. And you think, I've started collecting them now. And when we talk with Scott Montgomery, he really sees that as a key piece of his advice, is to find throughout his whole book, is to find really good pieces of writing that you like. And it's not plagiarising, but you're learning how to structure and using the way they do it. And for people who are speaking in English as a second language, so after our paper was published, we got an email from a development manager from Nature Research who teaches how to write papers in Singapore. And he sees, because people would say, and I live in a country, English is first language, I've always grown up with English, so I'm in a privileged position in that sense. People say, oh, it'd be a lot harder to write in a different way. But he teaches, and what he sees that when he was teaching students in Singapore, that he couldn't get them to see that they felt they had to copy that drow style of writing because that's what they saw was published, and he tried to get them out of that copying and trying to find good styles of writing to emulate. And that's why it's good to hear from scientists talking about these things. And this is more about Scott's book. I'm meeting up with Washington next week, and he talks a lot about emulation and how to do it. And I'll show you just an example. So he's a geologist by trade, and he's got this favourite paragraph that he always goes through. So, and then you can use an example of emulation. So it's a nice sentence, and then we rewrite it. We just made something up about our field of research and ocean acidification. So we haven't plagiarised it, but we've set up a similar, with a dilemma, eludes researchers. So there's that sort of tension in the sentence. And then the next one, despite compelling evidence, despite abundance evidence. And if you read through it, there's similarities between it, there and there, that commas use as a sort of pivot point. And then we go on, and we just wrote it and matched the points to learn how to write in a different way by just choosing your nice bits of writing. That's what I mean by emulation. And then obviously talk about value and also effort. I don't think anyone writes effortlessly. Like, it always takes huge amounts of work. So don't be disillusioned if it takes a long time.
Someone's not muted. Oh, here we go. Cool.
Yeah. Do you want me to read it out? So you can see similarities in the sentence structure and the points of tension. So it's not just a list of facts, which how we tend to write in science. There's conflict and tension in the sentence, which is like building a narrative and storytelling, which I'll go into a bit later.
Puzzling of all, that sounds a little bit sensationalist. Is it not? What do you feel?
And most puzzling of all, no, I don't. It's emotional, but I don't think it is. I don't think it is construing the data or misconstruing the data in any way. There's always a grey area. Like, I mean, when I write, I push it and see how far, and then I'm like, no, I need to bring that back a bit, to sort of. But most puzzling of all, it does create drama in the sentence, that's for sure. But does it sell something that's not true? I don't.
It's just selling your opinion, your
Yes.
feelings about it.
Yes.
And when I read something, I know that so people tend to think that their story, their subject is the most important.
Yes.
So I also study biological invasions.
Mm-hmm.
And I absolutely hate when people say that biological invasions are the worst the worst drama.
The worst threat in the world.
Because
Yes.
it's not, there are so many other dramas.
They're all bad threats, aren't they? Yes.
But you can put some drama in it. But you shouldn't start your paper with that, because if you are working with biological equations, then you can write that sentence over and over and over and over again. So it's not original, it's nothing. It's just overselling. And for me, it just means that you don't know what to write in your introduction.
Yeah. Yeah. So this in the paper we talk about ingredient X, because most often when you find good writing, you don't really know or understand why it's good. And we're still conducting research now to find out more why writing's good and why writing's bad, which is quite a, I don't think we're trying to take a scientific approach to it, but I still think it's a pretty hard thing to tackle. But these are just 4 of the things sort of I've thought about. Clarity, which is sort of a well-taught aspect of scientific writing already. Creativity, narrative, and sort of my made-up term of tangibility, which I'll get into. So we call this ingredient X, this X factor, without, you have this set of list after list facts, which cognitive science tells us is actually really hard to process. We process information much more quickly and readily, and there's lots of data on this when it's told in a narrative style, with tension in the sentences, etc., narrative structure. And you not only understand it better, you remember it more, and they've done memory tests and different styles of writing. So this is when I say our current style of writing is more focused on the data and the facts, and the writing's a means to an end. It's more focused on the writer. So what we're saying in changing the way we write, when you think about the reader who's tired and busy, has no time, trying to read your information, because I think at the end of the day, if your science isn't read, it doesn't exist. So that should be an important thing. So I do love this in terms of clarity. I think it's sort of taught a lot in scientific writing, so I don't go into it in much detail. But I like going to the literary greats, because they're the ones that write, and they're the ones that are really good at it. And I'll read this out aloud for the microphone. When your story is ready for rewrite, cut it to the bone. Get rid of every ounce of excess fat. This is going to hurt. Revising your story down to the bare essentials is always a little like murdering children, but it must be done. Stephen King. So I know when I write, it's always good to write with a colleague. So Sean and I would literally be like writing intensely on the keyboard, swapping, and then he'd be, walking around stretching, and I'd be taking over. And it's good to have someone else, because someone will get very attached to a piece. So I like writing papers that are just short and simple and have one key message. But it means letting go of a lot of fat, and that fat's really painful, because you've spent so much. Often you have to write this much and then whittle it down to this much to get the key thread in the paper, and it is painful. And you just have to tell someone, we've got to get rid of it, just do it, because you can't do it yourself a lot of the time. This is for clarity, I think one of the best tips is what Steve Pinker said, is prose that's hard for you to pronounce will almost certainly be hard for someone to comprehend. And he explains in his book, worth a read, he explains in his book how when you read your writing out aloud, you effectively become your reader. And he explains the psychology behind it. So if you read your sentences, as soon as you trip up with those words in your mouth, or they're a bit sticky, or they don't just sound right or flow right, usually that's what your reader will trip up onto. So now I read out all my writing that I want polished, I read it out loud, and you have to read it out loud. I also use this sentence because it's a really nice example of parallel syntax, which is a literary technique, which I've sort of learnt to pick up and use. So it's when you just have a balanced structure in your sentence. So I've highlighted that in purple. Prose that's hard for you to pronounce will almost certainly be hard for someone to comprehend. The hard's repeated twice, we repeat it, and then to comprehend, to pronounce. there's that repetition in words and there's that repetition in structure. And you can Google this, parallel syntax, and there's actually data out there to show that the brain processes that repetition quicker and the information, the uptake. So one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind is a famous example of parallel syntax. So there's a reason why we find that sentence so emotional and I can just remember it like that is because it's parallel syntax and that's got that mirrored structure. So I wrote about this and then I had to practice what I preach. So in my next paper, I tried to add it. And this is, for people who aren't in the marine biology field, this is not probably a typical way of writing some of our papers. Some of our papers are quite dry. So I used it. This counterintuitive response might involve both ecological adjustments that allow networks of species to compensate and microevolutionary adjustments that allow individuals within the networks to adapt. So I've got both adjustments twice and I've got to compensate and to adapt with two very deliberate choices of sentence structure. And there's this thing called cinemania, which I forgot to mention, and that's when we like to use lots of different versions of one word, and I did it a lot because I think it made the sentence more interesting, but it actually, because you're using, it can confuse the reader, so now I try to stick to one type of word and repeat it, and that helps it can sort of consolidate in someone's brain more easily. And then I did another one. The pH was about sea snails. The pH environment at time of collection was the same as the pH environment of their birth. You might think birth is a bit dramatic for a sea snail, but it sort of makes it more interesting to read. Here's some more tips from a famous writer, George Orwell, famous science fiction writer. I sort of agree with all of it, but again, it's about sort of clarity. I think you can put a lot from them because they know how to make writing interesting for readers. Never use a long word where a short one will do. Cut a word out, cut it out, cut it out. And I still think this can hold true for a lot of jargon. I think jargon's important with science, but we do overuse it and we can use lots of different words for the same.
What about topic 4?
I was wondering about that.
Yes, oh yeah, I did have a slide on that, and I've cut it out of talks because I think both are useful in scientific and using I and we. I mean, I use we a lot in terms of, but I've heard the best piece of advice. I went to it was a paper writing class run by Nature, and we had the editor-in-chief of Nature Genetics. And the best piece of advice when using things like I and we, because people feel too egotistical, if it's like I, and we, he goes, we just sounds stupid if every sentence is we. And he says, use it when you want to own it. So when you invented something, you discovered something, that's when you want your strongest take-home message. That's when you can use the active, because it does sound. Well, that will depend. Most of the time it's we now, because in terms of first author, I mean, I've never written, if we're talking just about peer-reviewed papers, I've never written a solo author paper, but I've only ever used we. But in terms of if you're writing like grants and prize applications where it's you're talking about yourself and I, but you do try to keep it a sensible. And curse of knowledge is a term, this is, we're talking about jargon, I think it's the most, I think we need some jargon, but this is the most, the curse of knowledge was developed by economists, and Steve Pinker reckons it's the best explanation why scholars write bad prose. I think I've got it written, and it's when you you'll generally overestimate always what you think someone else in the room you think knows what you think. So just copy a few lines from this book. There's difficulty in imagining what it's like for someone else not to know something you know. It simply doesn't occur to the writer that her readers don't know what she knows. So he goes on to say it's true that every writer must calibrate the degree of specialisation in the language against a best guess of what you know, what I think you know right now. But it's always wiser to assume too much than too little because of the curse of knowledge, that you will always from just naturally how your brain works, is you always overestimate what your neighbour knows. And I was in a classic example, I was in a workshop with 10 scientists from around the world, from 10 different institutions. They're all working in their niche discipline, and we're all writing a paper together on Google Docs or Drive in real time. And the lead writer kept using this word again and again, a key word. And so it's a key word to the paper. And then suddenly after day 3, someone said, I don't know what that means. And then it was around dominoes. And then someone said, I don't know. And then someone said, and there was one person standing that said, finally admitted, I had to Google it. So we're in this room where everyone had been working in the same field for 20 years. And there's someone was writing away using this word that nobody else knew what it meant. So it was just going to show the curse of knowledge, how you overestimate. So people get worried if they simplify things, it's dumbing it down. But at the end of the day, I know I find out a lot of what my peers do, but what comes up in the conversation or science news outlets, because it's easier to read in those forms in the scientific paper. This is sort of about creativity, and I've got a few things about breaking convention. And this was in another email from an editor-in-chief, so they're sort of the guardians of your papers, whether they like it or not. And I like this sentence from Tim Coulson, editor-chief of Ecology Letters, and he said, strict writing rules can be broken as this can improve clarity and reading enjoyment. So I really liked hearing this because he was all about the reader. For example, it is okay to break the rule of never starting or ending a sentence with and. So he wanted to break that rule because at the end of the day, the reader is the most important. Because if your reader actually reads it, then your science exists. If no one just glazes over, then it doesn't exist. So it was interesting to get that feedback from an editor.
And that sentence breaks the rule of ending a sentence with and.
I've never ended. Now I start a sentence with and all the time. I love it. But I've never ended a sentence with and. That sounds and full stop. I only just realised he said end a sentence in and sort of after I saw that quote several times. So this is an example where I like to use an example where you can use creativity, but I argue that it doesn't compromise your objectivity or accuracy. So Gary Provost was a famous teacher of writing in America. And I'll just read this out. This sentence has 5 words. Here are 5 more words. 5-word sentences are fine, but several together become monotonous. Listen to what is happening. The writing is getting boring. The sound of it drones. It's stuck like a record. The ear demands some variety. Now listen, I vary the sentence length and I create music. Music. The writing sings, has a pleasant rhythm, a lilt, a harmony. I use short sentences and I use sentences of medium length. And sometimes when I'm certain the reader is rested, I will engage him with a sentence of considerable length, a sentence that burns with energy and builds with all the impetus of a crescendo, the roll of the drums, the crash of the cymbals, sounds that say, listen to this, it is important. So Gary Provost talks about, don't just write words, write music. And this is where I like to say, if you write a paragraph up there in red, is that any less objective or accurate as this one here, or more accurate than this one here? And you're just varying sentence length, but you're engaging the reader more emotionally. And this is just an example where I tried to, when I was writing papers about this, I was sort of paranoid that I've got to, practice what I'm saying, and that's when I tried to use the yin and the yang symbolism there and getting some differences in it, something different in a science paper. and also the title, which we'll work on. Oops. So again, there's lots of, there was a recent paper come out in Nature Communications about how storytelling evolved, and they think it told because the better storyteller you were, your social status rose, and so we're very tied up in narrative and how our brains have evolved. There's a lot of research how we process narrative structure. And what science tend to do, we just tend to write a list of facts, one after another, and it's sort of and. And I think some people call that sort of a logical objective style, where each sentence is context independent, so they're standalone sentences, but they're very hard to process and remember. And so it's more storytelling. I'm still working out in my head what I think narrative is, because a lot of people bandy this word around and what actually is it. And it's when you've got a sense of time and context in your sentences. So your sentences are interlinked and they've got that sense of story from, beginning, middle and end. And so your sentences are dependent on each other rather than just a list of independent facts. That's how I'm understanding it. So this is a book which I haven't read yet, but my science communicator colleague at the University of Adelaide, who's formerly University of Adelaide, now runs his own science communication business, is this book by Randy Olson. He all talks about narrative, and he's based this formula of storytelling, and I haven't sort of used it, but it sort of makes sense in terms of what I've been talking about. He got this idea off the co-creator of South Park, the guy that writes that, and he always wrote his stories with this and, but, therefore. So you've got that conflict and tension in the sentence, and you can use that in science as well, rather than having this sort of list, logical, objective style of facts. And I've got this reference here. This is a really good, it's pretty old now, but it's a really good read. And it shows it's not all about jargon. This paper sort of emphasises this theme here. Topic position, what the sentences are all about at the start. Put the old information that links backwards. So I think this is all about narrative as well. So it's linking your sentences in the stress position, the new topic at the second part of your sentence. Put the new information that you want to emphasise and move forward with. But you can download that for free online. And what the paper does is it rearranges a paragraph. It's a very complex chemistry paragraph full of jargon. But it can show you can leave the jargon in and rearrange the sentence structure, and you can understand it much more clearly, or vice versa. And you can take the jargon out but not do a sentence structure like this, and you still can't understand it even with the jargon removed.
In the sentence, where is the topic position and the stress position? So the topic position will be at the beginning? Yes,
the topic of the sentence, that's from memory. And then the stress position was the second part of the sentence. But they explain it really well in this.
So about the previous slide. So nowadays, one of the things that I do, I start reading my papers by writing the abstract. And can I start writing the abstract because I go directly to the ABT structure? If I'm able to narrow it down to the ABT structure, then I expand that to the entire paper.
Yes, that's actually a really good idea. So you use that structure, and then you try to have your big chunks of section following that.
It's so hard just to write those 3 lines.
Yes. But often it takes a lot more effort to write less than it is more. Sometimes you feel like you're not being productive because you've only written a paragraph. If that paragraph is gold, I think it's worth it. But often you need to write more and then cut it down because it is so hard. It sounds simple, but it all takes a lot of effort. Yeah. So this is sort of my made up to boosting tangibility, because the opposite to that is reducing abstraction. Abstraction is the term they use a lot in the humanities, where you have abstract words, and counter to that you have concrete words. So abstract words are words that you don't perceive with any of your senses. So love is an abstract word, freedom, democracy, abstract words. Concrete words are those that you see, hear, touch, taste, smell, etc. And there's words that we tend to overuse abstract words. We need them because we talk about abstract concepts, so we have to have them. But we tend to, again, we like to dehumanise our speech, and often that's when we use abstraction to dehumanise, we make concrete words into abstract words. But again, when we use lots of abstract words, they're really hard to process by the brain. So I love this. I found this about concrete language and abstract language. I think it's put so beautifully that I'm going to read it out to you because I couldn't have said it better at all. Concrete terms refer to objects or events that are available to the senses. Examples include spoon, table, nose ring, green, hot, walking. If you ask me what I mean by the word spoon, I can pick up a spoon and show it to you. I can't pick up a freedom and show it to you or point to a small democracy crawling along a windowsill. I can measure sand and oxygen by weight and volume, but I can't collect a pound of responsibility or a litre of moral outrage. While abstract terms like love change meaning with time and circumstances, concrete terms like spoon, hot and puppy mean pretty much the same to you now as they did when you were 4 years old. So does this mean we shouldn't use abstract terms? No, we need them, of course, particularly in academia. You know, that's often where you talk about abstract things. We need these abstract ideas and concepts, and we need terms that represent them. But we must understand how imprecise their meanings are. Depending on who you are, they mean different things, how easily they can be differently understood, and how tiring and boring long chains of abstract terms can be. So now I'm sort of aware of that in my writing, looking at the ratio of concrete to abstract words. So these zombie nouns, and this is a term of abstraction that academics love to use. It's called normalization when nouns form from other parts of speech. So we turn a verb into a noun. Helen Sword writes a lot about this. She's got it in her books. I think I've got one of her books here, which is really good. Academics love them. I call them zombie nouns because they cannibalise active verbs, suck the lifeblood from adjectives and substitute abstract entities from human beings. So it's dehumanising the language, making it impersonal, which we like to do. And this is just some examples of, we've got an original word, achieve, apply. You can imagine a human doing those things, but you can't imagine a human achievement. They're not implementation. We use the word implementation instead of implement. So an example, you could say, I nearly postponed this talk. The jet lag just got to me and I couldn't cope with it anymore. So postpone, that's a person doing it. Or you could say, and academics might say instead, I implemented a postponement for this talk. So you're turning postpone into a noun. So I nearly postponed this talk. I implemented a postponement for this talk. Or you could take the human out of it altogether and say a postponement was nearly implemented for this talk. So there's no human involved whatsoever. And there is quite a lot of literature out there for things I've talked about in terms of greater use of concrete language. The psychology literature, there's a lot on it. Narrative structure and use of parallel syntax increases reader comprehension and uptake. And some of the research we want to do now is try to prove that more in a scientific way, because I think scientists relate to quantitative facts and figures. We show a graph, that's what we can work with. So people might, this is sort of an example where we use the black sheep analogy, which is an old English saying, you know, you're rebel of the family. And where we say clarity might be the easy thing, we can focus on jargon and convolution. And then creativity is the more thing there's more stigma associated with creativity in science, but that might be something you work with to the end. And can we have humour in science writing? That might be something we could think about. And I like ending this section on this quote by Ernest Hemingway, where you're all apprentices in a craft where no one ever becomes master. So it's a feel-good quote that we never master writing, but it also sums up that if we think of writing this way, if we value writing in science as a craft that we just constantly evolve and develop rather than just something we learnt in undergrad and that's it, that's how you write an abstract, we don't need to work on that anymore, that we can, you know, truly make our writing more readable. So, what's the time now? So I was just going to have, if people want to break for 2 minutes or something, or I can just keep going. This is just a comic abstract my colleague at Animate Your Science did up for me. That's his business. But we use the analogy of bread.
Are there any questions from our virtual audience? You can submit them to the chat. I'm pretty quiet, so I've been just live tweeting.
Okay. So I'll just let people. So next, once someone's gone out the room, I'll just go through a few examples. And then my writing style's changed a lot in the last couple of years. So I've read more about this. And personally, it's helped me in terms of more, you know, sort of academic world. It's definitely helped me in terms of producing writing that gets published more easily, gets out there more. And I'll just show a few examples of how we changed our writing.
So you would say by using these types of strategies, when you submit to journals, they're more accepting of your, like they accept your papers more easily?
I definitely think I submit to high profile journals for the same data. Yeah, much more easily. Yeah, in terms of the higher. And generally, if your peer reviewer thinks it's well written and they've said so, they're usually in a better mood. So I think the peer review process, obviously, it's always a battle, but it can work more smoothly. In terms of turnaround time, yeah.
To what extent do you think that where you are in your career matters? So kind of taking a risk with your writing and kind of getting out of the conventional box. Is that something that once you're established and well known in your career, you can then deviate after you've proven yourself to be credible, to be a credible scientist? Or would you recommend this approach for young scientists who might not have already had named themselves?
Because there is sort of a stigma involved in writing a bit differently, it is easier if you've got a name and credible name, because I think a lot of the better papers are written by professors that are, you know, near retirement, and then they write this amazing piece because they're into the career and everyone loves it, but they've got that credibility behind them. I would like to say you should be able to start writing that from straight up, but then the reality of that is I've got a little bit about education at the end of this. After we do the titles, it's like 5 minutes, because the feedback we've given similar talk to government scientists, university scientists around Australia and in University of Hong Kong. And what we find from the feedback, anonymous feedback, is the early career and student level is they want to write in a different way and they feel motivated, but they're scared to. That's what they write. And so we get these, I feel inspired and motivated, but they're worried that they might get penalised for it in some way as well. So we talk a little bit, that's why we went a talk at an Education Futures conference about how we can, and we want to do research about giving people permission. And there's this miscommunication. So you see all those quotes from editors saying we want this style of writing, but there's this sort of miscommunication from from scientists that they want us to write in a certain way and they don't necessarily. But I mean, I do in peer review, I do get told to write more conservatively, and then I usually write to the editor and tell them this is why I've done it, and I give them references, and I argue myself out of it, and then they let me keep it. Yeah.
I'll ask another very specific question, but like especially at the end of like introductions, like, you know, this is like the aim of the project or the study or whatever. Sometimes I feel like people move into present tense, like we we.
I always get confused whether to use present or past as well.
Okay, so there's active, there's passive, and there's like present and past. And I'm like, the present and past, I'm always like, oh, like I sort of find myself flicking between the two, and I'm like, is that okay? Like, what am I doing? And
Yeah, I suppose traditionally I've used past and active, but I know people have moved.
Sometimes I see it and I'm like, oh, it sounds good, I like it. But
Yeah.
I'm like, when can I use that?
Yeah, but it doesn't mean, I think a lot of the books I've shown you about by Helen Sword, Steve Pinker, Montgomery, they're very like, don't be focused on rules as well. I think sometimes we're very rule driven and you write what sounds good rather than being too focused on the rules, rather than telling people you must write. I think you should write aims paragraphs like this. So I'm going to sort of follow that ethos that I don't think there's any set way. Yeah. Is everyone back? So I'll keep going. So these are just a couple of examples which Sean and I were sort of changing our writing style. And this is sort of a typical title he used to write, you know, and I used to like, oh, it just sounds so, you know, that type of world. Can we sort of change it a bit? So ocean acidification is a resource for driving positive bottom-up effects on calcifying herbivores. Does people know what that means straight away, particularly if you're outside that field? It's like, no. So I changed it to how ocean acidification can benefit calcifiers. You would need that little bit of knowledge from the marine world that ocean acidification is known to be very bad for calcifiers. So we were showing, you know, in our natural vents how it can benefit them through greater food. So you did need that little bit of knowledge. And what we also did is now I'm all, you know, I write, my personal style is I write short papers with a sort of one clear message. So it was already a short paper for our field, about 3,000 words, and we cut it down to 15. But it wasn't taking out content. It was like you're putting more in with less, but that takes more time. So it actually took, it's only a 1,500 word paper, but it actually took maybe longer. And there's this great quote by the American philosopher, Henry Thoreau. It may take a long while for a story to be, it takes the longest time for a story to be short or something, I can't quite remember it. So it does take more time to reduce it down, I find anyway. This is another one we changed. It was originally destined for a very specialist marine journal. I'm like, no, we can do better than that. We can broaden it out. And I changed the title. Nutrients as drivers of seagrass, a test for the occurrence of threshold effect. Originally, I first looked at that straight away. You don't need occurrence of because you're already testing it. You already know that it's occurred. So there's something you can cut out straight away. Shorter titles are generally better. There's stats that show that. And we've generally taken out nutrients because that was, in our world, that was just sort of a case study. We're really looking at these threshold effects. And this is, yeah, also.
This is kind of like a small details question, but do you favor colon in the title or do you prefer just to have us?
I love colons in the title personally, but some journals don't allow punctuation in the titles, and then I get really upset when they, because I spend a lot of time crafting titles because I think that helps me craft the whole story. I do titles first, and I spend a lot of time doing it, mixing up words, and I do like colons. And then you'll get it in a journal that says no punctuation. And then I have to, you know, I have a little like.
Just do it.
Yeah. So this is just a paragraph we originally had in this paper when it was originally, theory suggests that if alteration of key environmental condition, controlling variable leads to a threshold or tipping point being passed, in further relative changes in the environmental condition will lead to large sudden changes in either process, recruitment or mortality rate, or state. You know, oh my God, that's quite. So in here, originally where I just sort of looked at this, it's a lot of abstract terms. We've got process and state. What does that actually mean? That can mean completely different things to different people. We've got more words for one thing. We've got alteration and change. We've got some unnecessary detail. The sentence is broken up a lot by brackets. And it's sort of hard to digest. So when you read it out loud, The better version, theory suggests that ecological systems are susceptible to abrupt change, quality or property, where small changes in environmental conditions produce large responses. So there's a little bit of parallel syntax in that last bit there, and it's just a cleaner result. And I'm just going to touch a little bit on graphs, because I think how you write, if you write with a sense of story and narrative, it ties completely in with the graphs. And I sort of find writing and doing the stylising, doing data visualisation in tandem with the graphs. So this might be a typical, more sort of student paper with graphs going up and down. I find them really quite hard to digest. You know, this was what this is originally in the paper, and we're like, you know, I sometimes set myself challenges to have no column graphs in the paper or no bullet points in a presentation like this one I tried to do. So I was sort of like, how do you even know what's going on there? So when you write with this more a sense of narrative and some of the things I'm talking about, that ties really nicely. So we turned these graphs into this, which was a sort of much simpler figure and more interesting to read. And then again, some of the latest ones I did, I knew this journal, you know, I knew the editor, you know, they like their glossy one figures. So I thought, how can I do this without doing a column graph? And I spent a lot of time designing this figure, but I did it in tandem with the writing as well. And I think they really help clarify each other, because if you can tell your story in one figure, usually then that really helps you tell your story in a few paragraphs. So I did this talk at a fisheries agency, a state government agency in South Australia. And so they write more applied papers, and they're more focused on writing reports than papers, and their writing style is a bit different. And they wanted me, one of the academics, they wanted me to look at scientists there, look at their paper, because he thought the paper had a good story and he wanted to publish it in a more broader journal, because they tend to publish in very specialised fisheries journals that are very specific to the local region. So this was the original title. So that's generally what I work on, is titles and abstracts in terms of thinking of the story. I did this quickly. I only read the abstract. I didn't read the paper. So what I could tell from reading the abstract. So this is the original title: A Code of Practice for Mitigating Accidental Interactions Between Purseine Fisheries and Cetaceans. So I initially looked at this and I'm like, an accidental interaction, what is that? That's the most abstract term I could even come about. It means death, but we can't say death because it's dolphins and that's emotional. But because it is an accidental interaction, we want to mitigate that because that's a bit politically sensitive for the fishing industry. But here, I would say they're trying to prevent it. They're preventing it, so it's a good thing. So why hide the fact? They're talking about accidental interactions, which is so abstract. I mean, if you walk to someone up into the street and you're saying, I'm preventing an accidental interaction, do you think they would understand what you meant? But if you had said, I'm preventing the deaths of dolphins, they'd think, wow, that's a good thing. That's relevant to the whole world and not just a fishery in South Australia. So first looked at that. And Purseine fisheries, how many people in the room know what a Purseine fishery is? Yeah, see, not many. And, so they wrote, so it's sort of like... And code of practice is a very abstract thing. There's no people or humans behind that. It makes you yawn, a code of practice. So I just came up with an alternative title quickly: Optimising Fisher Behaviour to Prevent Accidental Deaths of Cetaceans. So I put fisher behaviour because it's putting the fishers back in, the fishermen and women back in the story, and you're preventing an accidental death and you want to optimise that. So that's how I sort of tackled that one. And here's the abstract. So at first I sort of thought we needed to talk about what Purseine fisheries were, because they're in sort of Purseine world and they forget the curse of knowledge that nobody really knows what a Purseine fishery is, like all of us do. So we want to keep it positive. They do this and they're great because they do have very minimal bycatch. But so I've changed it here in the purple, and I've created yet, because that creates tension in the sentence, like however or but. But marine mammals, especially dolphins, become trapped. So I use the word trapped because everyone knows what trapped means. Instead of, they could picture that, instead of reduce accidental mortality. result in accidental mortality. I use the word trapped because you don't really know how per se fisheries and dolphins interact. And then I've put we, put the we in there, it's more active, because I wanted them to own the code of practice, because it's not just some code of practice out in the world. I wanted them to show the world that they developed this code of practice that fishers could follow, that then could prevent. And then it's much broader. And then I made some more changes. What did I do? The code of practice provided changes in fishermen behaviour there. And I took out a lot of the numbers, because numbers are really hard to process. So here they've got more details that I don't think were really relevant in terms of, they're all in the paper. But I said over a decade, instead of from some date, over a decade, the Australian fishery. And I've put nearly eliminated, instead of, they've put 10 years after the code of practice was introduced, annual encirclements and mortalities reduced by 87% to 57%. I sort of wondered why someone around the world would actually care about the specific number of dolphins. They want to learn about the percentage. And nearly eliminated, just put the main key figure there. And then again, try to take home the key one, which they did, reduce dolphin deaths by 97%, which is huge. So I think a lot of here people talk about, so I've talked about this to a lot of different people, and people say, my topic's harder to convince a broader audience of. I'm looking at some tiny critter in the mud that nobody cares about. But I think everyone can have a difficult topic. Some people might say marine science is hard to talk about because you're not studying on humans, but some people would say marine science is easy because you're playing with, whales and dolphins. But I think all science can be written in a dry or approachable way, and I just love using this example. So this guy, Greg Rouse, he's a polychaete taxonomist. And taxonomies are traditionally a very dry subject, and polychaetes are these worms that probably wouldn't get up much in their charismatic stakes. And he writes in these amazing journals like Science and PNAS. And just look how he describes, his polychaete taxonomy, which could be just seen as one of the most driest topics out there. But he says, we describe a new genus, Ocedax, and 2 new species of annelids, with females that consume the bones of dead whales. And I think that's beautiful, consume the bones of dead whales, rather than, you could imagine a more typical feeding activity on the, skeletal tissue remains of, cetacean taxa or something like that, I don't know. And then this one, Ocedax has been destroying bones. People might think that's a bit emotive, but I like it. For most of the evolutionary history of whales, I think that's really nice. And at the end of the day, I actually read a paper on polychaete taxonomy, which I never would have read. So this is where people sent in titles, and we can have a play around with them. We did this in Hong Kong, and it was a really good experience because, most people are, first language. There's lots of European students there, and also people, Cantonese is their first language. That's a huge language divide, and this was just the title, and one of the PhD students worked on it, and I still think, I don't really knew what a stomatopod was. It was from zoology days, but she thought it was important. But she rewrote her title into something like that, which was a great improvement in terms of getting outside the Hong Kong world. So people sent through titles, and there's 2 things. We can go through the titles. I've also got an example in my paper that I wrote. I rewrote, the paper has 2 abstracts. The official abstract, which is rewritten in a more approachable style, and then I rewrote the abstract in a traditional style, which I thought how scientists might traditionally write it. So this is the sort of false abstract that I rewrote, and then the next page is the... So we could have a go at rewriting that and what you think how that could be improved. And then you could see the version I wrote. Or we could have a look at some of the titles people sent through and how we could work through them as well. And then I just had, after that, a few minutes of slides just talking about what we're doing in the education scene, and that's it for today. So got lots of titles sent through.
Yeah, why don't we, since these are titles sent through from the participants in this room, I'd like to, if anyone wants to volunteer their title, we can go ahead and use the whiteboard here to
so I had a look. Those. So you're going to have to help me because I'm in a jet lag brain. So you're going to have to help me rewrite these titles. And most of them you don't polish them off, but you get a sense of where the title may go. And what I do is I do spend a lot of time crafting a title before I've got to sketched out the data, and then I just craft this title, and then that just sets the scene. So that's why I like to use titles as an example. So I did.
Would anyone like to volunteer as the first title?
Or I could just pick one. I did read.
Or we could pick one from someone who.
And I'll just write it up on the board. It's all friendly, and we'll just pick apart your title.
Okay.
But
I don't remember which title they sent.
I did work through.
Which one? What's your name?
Anna Denico.
Okay. Did you sign up before, or?
Yeah, I did. My name is there.
Okay. I probably have here. Okay. Oh, I see. Okay, Anna, you sent in.
I think I sent a shorter one and a longer one.
Okay, it's reducing. Reducing key bovine infertility in a global warming world.
Oh, I love that one. That one was great.
And you said it too.
Yeah.
The second one was investigation of ovarian stem cells in cattle and their potential for gametogenesis. Okay.
So that one's grant proposal title, which we could work, but it is a little bit different because you don't have the results yet. So it's sort of, so I'm wondering if, but I did love your reduced heat. I really love that because it captured me because you had the problem, the story, the solution, all in one flow. So in terms of, so this one I thought was,
Can you repeat the good one? Not that this isn't good, but
no, this one.
This is the good one.
This is the one I liked. Yeah. But we could work on it. Anything can be, as Ernest Hemingway says, anything can be worked on. So this one's a grant one, and I just maybe thought we could leave that one because we've got so many titles, we won't have enough time to go through them all. And just because grants are a bit different because you don't have they're not result driven.
But you could still have a title that is
True.
catching, right? At least.
Yes.
Which I don't think that my second one really is.
No,
But
it's a little bit abstract and jargony. Yeah. We could work on it. Yeah, I think it's great. It's just like, yeah. Like everyone sort of understands from different fields. You sort of understand the problem there, and you've got reducing what you've done.
Cryptic invasions of view. You put in good ones. Are you supposed to put in like your bad titles?
So I struggle a lot with this paper.
Yeah.
And sometimes when I read the titles on some journals, especially on tree, they tend to be really short.
Yeah.
They avoid the species.
Yeah.
And when
species is a death now in those journals.
Species, the place.
Yeah.
So they are very broad.
Yeah.
And when I read those titles, I'm super excited because I'm going to know everything about this topic, whatever it is, about the climate change, about the ocean acidification. When I go there through the abstract, it's it's about this particular species during this particular life stage, during 1 week in the lab. And I'm usually disappointed. So this paper this title is short.
Yeah.
The paper is a review. It's about 15 pages, but it's...
I feel that it could have more like, what's the motivation behind, where's the sort of story, like, what's the problem, or why do you want to know? Writers and reader want to know about cryptic speciation. So what's the motivation behind doing a review, and can you put that into your title more in terms of
why are cryptic invasions good or bad?
Yes, like what's the story behind there? Is it that they're hard to detect, or is it there's lots of controversy around cryptic invasions, or whether they happen? Is it because they're the biggest threat in the world, or?
So in the case of cryptic invasions, you have two things in this story. You have the interspecific invasions, so different species, and because they are different species, but because they resemble so much, they remain undetected until it's too late. Yeah. And then you also have interspecific invasions, and for example,
those words are difficult. I used to use those inter and intraspecific. I think
so. For example, here in the US, you have the populations of Phragmites australis, and that not australis, Phragmites. No, it's a plant from the south. So, and because of the genes, because they are slightly different, they have different consequences on the environment. They become invasive.
So maybe we won't rewrite, because just so everyone can get sort of covered and talked, you won't sort of rewrite each one perfectly, but could there be something like,
I'm just going to keep reading.
Uncovering, uncovering cryptic invasions, and I don't know, I'm just making things up, uncovering cryptic invasions, and I've got what I was next to say. And uncovering cryptic invasions, and whether they happen, or there needs to be some motivational story. What is it that and their prevalence?
I think the title lacks emotion. Lacks,
uncovering and their prevalence in the natural world. Review.
And,
what's really behind cryptic invasions? Something like that. What's behind cryptic invasions? Uncovering the secret of cryptic.
Something like not the untold stories about cryptic invasions, the untold story about biological invasions. Something well, not this, but something. Because this lacks emotion.
Yes.
And the entire paper was a really challenge with the.
And it seems to the motivation. So I think I looked at this one. So
I think what is this yours?
As a person who had no idea what cryptic invasions are, because I'm in the field of human nutrition, I want to know more.
Yes.
Like, that sounds really fascinating.
So it is a cool. I think the word cryptic invasion is a cool word, and you could play on that, like uncovering the secrets of some crypsis.
I feel that it lacks something. At the beginning, the article author, he wanted just cryptic invasion.
So we could look at. I had a read of that one on the. I think I looked at this one on the plane. So
that's really sad. You started a long time about this one.
So this one sounds quite specialist, particularly to people in human sciences over there. What does that even mean? So, I mean, this is one of my fields here, so I've sort of got a bit of a cheat with it. And I often think, I know what this is, and I don't know if it's really key to the story, laser ablation, multi-collector, ICPMS.
Is it like the mass spectrometry?
Yeah, it's a type of mass spec in terms of the method of analysis. If this was the first time you're using multi-collector to analyse maybe sulfur isotopes or whatever, a new thing, you might have it key to the story. But one, the title was too long. So what will you cut out in terms of, I'm not sure that's key. And then I was playing around with it.
Notice there's someone who's pretty lazy and never reads anything anymore. It's sometimes really useful to be given so much information. And so I just be like, oh, okay, I know what I'm getting with this.
Yeah.
You know, like, it's like very clear.
Yes, that's true.
I agree.
But that's you finding maybe in your specialist field. And part of me, someone said to me, oh, if we just write general titles like you're advocating, we'll just end up, all our titles will end up sounding the same and they'll be able to find anything. Which I agree with. But then I'm more on the side of we should be reading more outside our disciplines, because I think that's when the real inventions and big science happens. So I'm more on that, but it's a personal preference. There's no black and white. But for this one, I think I was writing something like, so I think we could just use strontium isotope. We don't need those numbers. Don't think we need that. And I do like the alliteration of scales and spines. And I was wondering whether you needed fin rays as well. Probably non-lethal is very effective, but it doesn't. So I had something like, but it's not perfect. I'm still playing with it. Reconstructing the life history of fish without harm, the potential strontium isotope analysis in scales and spines. That was my rewritten version that I did half asleep, but you could. So,
Can you repeat that?
yeah, reconstructing the life history of fish without harm. So I was trying to find a different word as non-lethal, because non-lethal just sounds a bit. Can't we have a word that's opposite to lethal that's not non-lethal? But anyway, that was just my little bugbear. So reconstructing the life history of fish without harm, colon, love my colon. The potential of strontium isotopes. So you could just put SR for short there. Strontium isotope analysis in scales and spines. I did quite like the scales and spines iteration, or you could put fin rays as well. But do fin rays and spines kind of cover the same thing, do they? They're kind of spiny things. I don't know. Or you can make that judgment.
No, I like that change a lot.
Yeah.
So we actually spent a lot of time thinking about the first title, which is kind of now looking at it like, yeah, it's weird. But it was supposed to go to a very specialized journal.
So this would get you in, this is much more, and you could, I would say you could boost the impact factor of your journal by writing more like that, because that would, a more broader journal would just probably go no straight away. But yeah. Oh, what's this one? I don't know if that one was in my list. Impact of the Berkeley excise tax. Oh, this is a bit more outside. On sugar sweetened beverage consumption. Oh, this is interesting though. This is the sugar tax. So can we say sugar tax? Because I know what the sugar tax is, even in Australia. Because is it?
It's just in sugar.
Yeah, I know they brought it in Britain as well. So it's coming up in the news as something that's going to, like, you know, collapse Coke and things like that, because they're going to tax them. Do you need to use the word Berkeley?
I guess we don't know.
Well, it's
So-
specific to, so Berkeley, the city itself has its own, it's not
Yeah.
a California way, I think.
Because I quite like then putting the colon. So you take the broader, and then you can say a case study from Berkeley,
Okay.
or the Berkeley beverage industry, a case study. But then you say you have the broader topic on the left side, and then I quite like going dot. Yes.
I don't like, for example, to call the attention for the place of study,
No.
because sometimes what reviewers would tend to say, especially when I was younger, they would say that my studies were that my papers were site specific or species specific. So if you,
I've had to do it for a couple of tough papers of mine. They're very localised, specialised, and I have used the a case study from when I couldn't ignore the location. Most of the time I can, and it's tended to work. But I mean, sugar tax, I think, is strong. You could bring in more. Yeah, because I think beverage consumption is very abstract. There's no humans in beverage consumption, but drinking or drinks is much more related to humans, and I think you can bring that human element in between that. You know, the effect of sugar tax on drinks. Or you could have, yeah.
I'm not as happy with an impact of sugar tax on drinks just because it's like, well, so are we talking about the impact of the tax on what?
Or
on
the
people
industry.
drinking things, on people, on what drinks people are choosing, on that's a little harder to tell. But I see what you're saying about the
it's not, and it might be like,
very
I don't know, the beverage industry or sugar tax and beverage industry. The excise tax. I don't really know what excise tax
It
means.
just means that the producer, the people producing the product pay the tax, and they have the option to pass it on to the stores and consumers, but they pay the tax.
But you could sort of talk about that maybe in the abstract.
I feel like something like this. I like that because like grabs attention, but I feel like this bit here, you can do something about more about what it's actually about.
Yes.
Like, it's not necessarily Berkeley, but about. It's
I
about
think because
drinking.
everyone knows, or sugar tax is quite
Does it affect drinking rates or something?
upfront. Lots of people know what that means, and it's a controversial issue that's going to sort of change things.
Is this study looking at the impact on people consuming it,
Yeah,
or
it's not the industry, it's not people drinking sugary drinks.
Like, right.
Yeah, their consumption.
Okay, next one. No, this one wasn't on my list before. Findings from a quasi-experimental evaluation of the Rethink Your Drink high school curriculum, California.
A title that I thought would be kind of catchy is like Rethink Your Drink.
Yeah.
You could just say rethink the drink, Carlon.
I often think these words are double. Like, I'm not sure how to quite rewrite this yet, but often we do this, we double up, without saying quasi-experimental evaluation, can you just say quasi-experiment? Because you already know you're evaluating it if you're doing an experiment. So you can take that out and move that sort of, now that's a much more chunkier word, rather experimental evaluation, and move that around more where it might go.
Rethink your drink, Carlon. Findings from a quasi-experiment in California.
Yeah, or from a high school, you could just put from a high school, I don't know what it was, like a high school. So it was high school.
It was an intervention where we taught Rethink Your Drink as a curriculum, a nutrition curriculum for high school students. And it specifically was developed in California from the California Department of Public Health. And my job was to evaluate it, and I used a quasi-experimental design to do so. So that's kind of the background of what I did.
The high school part is important because it's already been, the curriculum is already set for elementary, for younger students.
It's specific to high school students.
Yeah, and so we're trying to adapt.
Or you could also rewrite this so it's about the result and not the method you used, rather than findings of, what did you actually find?
They probably wouldn't like that.
No, they
These
wouldn't like
are
that.
very interesting findings.
They weren't very interesting findings. Nothing. Yeah.
Well, then maybe in a Californian high school.
Maybe like consequences of Rethink Your Drink.
Yeah.
So what was did they just not want to do? They didn't want to rethink.
I mean, so to be clear, are very apathetic. To be clear, it was not fighting, but it was more about we were using this to then improve the curriculum. So though they were null, we have ways to improve it now. So, but yeah, in terms of consumption,
That would be the
Improving rethink your dream.
Yeah, or translating findings into improvements, or something.
But that does come into like so much now. It's like, you have like these like really exciting results for every single paper, but it's like, well, those actually those not results are important.
They are
Like,
important.
How do you write 60 titles?
I know. Well, some people go, so and so does not affect.
Yeah,
you know,
true.
there's been a few like, OA does not affect fish, and that's the title.
But what doesn't affect you?
Ocean acidification does not affect fish. That was, I had a go at this one before.
Oh, this is Rachel.
Interesting.
Sorry, that's like quick.
Yeah.
She wanted me to.
You could just put scientific name. You probably don't need to add it. You could just there's a scientific name in there.
She gave you her driest paper title ever on purpose.
Yeah. So I did work on risk assessments and frameworks, and I had to really struggle coming up with the title. And I originally wrote a new interesting title, and the reviewer didn't like it, and then I argued to keep it. Yeah. So when I first read this, I thought, oh, there's a whole string of abstract words up front. It's framework, assessing, factors, influencing, and it's quite sort of, if you read it scientific out loud, scientific framework for assessing factors, influencing, already getting out of breath, endangered, some river on winter run, Chinook, did I pronounce that right, please? Salmon, need to put a salmon one in here, across the life cycle. So this one was quite tricky. I was kind of thinking a way of cutting down, particularly the first. I don't probably think you need to mention the word scientific because we already know this is scientific. It's going to be published in scientific journals, so how we could cut that down.
Yeah. Could it be, maybe they would like to emphasize the science and not the management?
Yes, it might depend on what, like some papers are more about the management. I don't know what the target, without reading the abstract, is a bit, or having Rachel here. But that's, I think you could do more about the science. So I sort of was thinking, cutting down factors influencing, cutting that out. I think I've got instead a framework for assessing the threats to fish. Because threat, you're replacing endangered with threat because you can threaten it and then it's threatened. Colon, a case study using endangered salmon. Trying to make it more. So this is location and species specific. It is very reliant on that, the science, because I did a risk assessment which was focused on a region, and it's quite hard when you do often have to, occasionally you have to mention it. That's what I was sort of playing with. For assessing threats to fish. Yeah.
Said Rachel the video.
And then you're cutting out, if it's just an endangered salmon, then you probably don't need it. It's an endangered salmon species. You probably don't need to know what species it is.
Yeah, because it does get like, even like it has like Sac River, Windsor Run, Chinook.
Oh, that's how Windsor Run.
That's the endangered component.
So it gives the impression that the only people want to read it is people studying winter run salmon in the Sac River.
No, it's the Sacramento River.
Okay.
Yeah. No, I agree.
Could it just be like to an endangered fish and nothing
Yeah.
else?
Yeah.
I mean,
You could cut out salmon altogether. The only thing, I think I put fish, then I had fish twice in the sentence, and then I thought that's too much.
that's almost so.
Yeah.
No, so I was just saying,
Yeah.
deleting all this
Oh,
and then
yeah.
including to an endangered fish.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, I like that.
Could you replace a framework for assessing threats with what threatens?
Well, it was very
That
specific
changes it a
about-
bit because it's not what threatens, it's working out what
Yeah,
threatens.
it's a method.
It's a method focused paper because I think that's what it is a method working out what rather than you don't know what threatens it yet.
Exactly. And how do we work
Figure
that
Yes,
out?
yes.
Yeah. Like, do we need monitoring in these key locations, like data gaps? So it was how do we assess it? Yeah, I was on the same, but this is,
Yeah.
So it's only salmon instead of fish, or like know that it's salmon, just because there's such a charismatic species here in California, and people care about them.
and all over the world. So
All
when
over
does
the world,
make
yeah,
it
it's like if I
California?
can just
Yeah.
hear
They
in
are.
honor.
I love that you said that.
So it might depend on where you want to target that audience for that title, whether you include salmon or not. Because in Australia or I think when you start getting overwhelmed with salmon papers because they're not we're not emotionally engaged with salmon. We don't care about salmon because well we like them, we farm them. They might say it's harsh, we don't care about them. We do, but we don't. They don't resonate with us or other parts of the world like they might resonate with you. So it might be depending if this was a report going out for this side of the US or you might put salmon depending on your journal choice, or you might be for up to an endangered fish.
The journal was the San Francisco Bay Journal.
That's very specialist.
I'm thinking, could you write with a bit mad say endangered species?
That's probably too
But you
much.
could say an endangered species. That might make it like still
Not
sexy.
endangered,
Not
plural.
just endangered species in general, but like an
Endangered.
endangered species.
To endangered fish.
Yeah, it was my.
I think you probably need fish.
You need
rather-
fish, okay,
yeah,
right.
because that could be like pandas and
Right.
you know. Like,
Oh, that's salmon when they read
Hmm.
it.
Oh god.
but you could put salmon. I think that would be a choice about where you're submitting it because it has a lot of emotion here, but it doesn't have emotion in other parts of the world. Like in our part of the world, the freshwater fish that everyone works on is Murray cod, and all the titles of journals Murray cod, and if I put here, but it's Murray cod, you're like, so it's like this big and it lives to 80 years old, but you don't know that when you read the,
Yeah, so the second line, people from working in the Amazon would read that.
Yes. And it because this is method based, and this is what I did with my framework papers, where I'm thinking, how could I sell them? Risk assessment papers, when I focused then on the method, because it was so location specific. So to make this broader, I'm going to focus this on a method based, because then that could be moved to any situation.
Funny, you must put in like titles of stuff that's already published. You can't change them. Like in hindsight, I wish I could. In this different future ones, I reckon putting ones that are going to publish would be better because, like, I'm like, oh, no, I'm just going to email you my possibility.
So I've seen a few people leave, but before everyone leaves, I just want to make sure that everyone has a chance to fill out this feedback survey. I've made a easy link that you can access on your phone or your
Be
laptop.
great as well,
to-
very useful to me.
Yes, and we're really help Zoe out with your presentation. If you signed up for me previously, I've already sent an email to you in your inbox. All right, check that out.
Thank you. Everyone fill this in.
Yes. Okay. Do you want to do?
I had 5 minutes, but I don't have to go through it. If people, it's already an hour and a half. It's a long time. I can just skip through it. That was my previous abstract, which was I deliberately wrote in that style. I wrote this abstract and then I rewrote it in the boring style and published that as an example. So that was the first one. Well, it's a fake one, really. And that was the second one.
Do you still think that size matters?
In terms of the length of the...
In terms of just because of the reviewers.
In terms of the length of the paper?
Yeah.
They do all the metrics they've done on paper length and title length. They do. It's weak, but they generally says if your abstract's shorter, your title's shorter, you get cited more. Generally, there's papers out there that show it, that there's lots of confounding factors that influence citation rate. It's the topic, it's the data, it's where you put it. But generally, senior author, but generally how well you promote it, how much media you do, but generally there's a weak link between length of title and abstract and citation rate. Yeah.
And about the probabilities of being written. So there's this thing, at least in Portugal, that if you publish a shorter paper, that the title is labeled as a short communication, then when you are evaluated, then you have
there may be the metrics between countries. I know for us it doesn't matter if your paper's a short communication or a full paper, it's still the same. There's difference between empirical papers and review papers in some systems in Australia. Review papers get less points than an empirical paper. Oh, that's just the Australian Research Council doesn't rate them as high. I don't agree with this, but that's just way, whether short or long, I don't think there's any. I think if all your CV was all like rapid communications and there's no like meaty papers in there, they might go, oh, what's... I mean, generally I like writing shorter papers. I enjoy them more. Just keep it. Yeah. But yeah, I just had more that when we wrote this piece for the conversation, we had lots and lots of comments. We're quite overwhelmed and the readers were quite split. Some people didn't agree what we were saying, but the ones that didn't agree were generally, I would say, the older male demographic, and the ones that did were from all sorts of groups that sort of were really interested in change. And it was sort of just about breaking this miscommunication. And these are sort of comments we get from survey feedbacks anonymously, like they want to write differently, early career researchers and students, but these are some of the concerns they have. So that's when we're like, there's this brick wall we need to break down. And these are some of the texts from some of the writing guides from Australian universities, and they're very dry, not much focus on reader engagement, and that's what we want to change.
I was jumping that brick wall and concrete as well.
Yeah. Well, now I say with writing, you have like less zombies and more concrete. That's why sort of, and that was just about imagination and creativity, giving permission. And that's what we're doing now, hopefully with Siro Publishing, our Australian publishing company, to do more research on this. But I just wanted to leave that quote in the talk.
Well, thank you so much, Zoe.